last couple book club winners have been a little harder to take the same kind of in-depth look at that I usually do for these. So I've decided I'd just sort of take a brief look at a couple of the last entries. Maybe people will be more interested in that anyway. But the first one, which is the current book club selection, is Eternal Growth. It is a 36-word RPG, which was made, it appears, for a 36-word RPG jam. Yeah, I mean, just generally looking at presentation, it's fine so far. This part, I believe, is not included in the 36-word count. The forest of eternal growth is a mysterious, living wilderness whose borders are unknown and nature itself is unpredictable. No one who entered the forest returned. Yeah, unless this is like this for word count reasons, this should be no one who has entered the forest has returned, or something like that. No one who entered the forest returned. Maybe I'm wrong about it, but that just kind of sounds wrong. Trees, plants, and the entire space change in a way that defies logical explanation. Time and space are distorted. Legend has it that deep in the forest, there is an artifact that gives control over reality. You enter the forest to be the first person to emerge alive, discovering secrets that can change your lives. However, the longer you stay there, the more the forest affects your memories and reality. So that's a sort of basic premise, which works well for something that's only going to be a rules-light 36-word game. No obvious flaws to that either, except for maybe some word choice or grammar that could be switched around a bit. Actual rules. Story. Yeah, so the story follows the path of exploring the forest, finding the artifact, and then escaping. For risky action, you do a check with 3d6, and then you assign to tables and resolve. So these would sort of be the tables, except, they're not really tables because it's more of a numbered list. But basically, you would have a single-person solo journaling or a GM and a group of players. It said you could do either in the description of the game, not one included in the game itself, but from the post. And first, the group would be trying to explore the forest. They would encounter something that would make them do a risky action of some kind, presumably rolling 3d6. Actually, you could really call it 1d6 per table. Rolling 3d6 really makes it sound like you're adding up the value, but I suppose just 3d6 is simpler for word count reasons. Anyway, the result can be really bad, misfortune, which is interpretive, but I guess you would call, you move forward potentially, but there is some kind of consequence, like it doesn't necessarily fail. And then you have solution and success. It's hard to differentiate those, so that should probably be made more clear. And then 6, control, which is, if I had to guess, the player decides what happens without GM input, but, generally sort of vague. So I'd say this table, not, amazing in terms of figuring out what each entry is supposed to mean, since so many of them sort of seem like synonyms. Alright, cost, perdition. I'd have to look that up, but if I looked it up, I think I would be able to understand what it means. Sacrifice, sure. Time, sacrifice and time are kind of easy to understand. Summoning, that sounds interesting. I assume that would mean some kind of enemy appeared or something. Transformation, that's another one that is relatively easy to understand, but has a lot of potential. Memories. So this table is better, because it's got more interesting results that are easy to differentiate from each other. It's still hard to figure out how these things would really work out in the framework of such a rules-like game, but this is generally a better list than the first one, I'd say. Then consequence, damage. Yeah, cost and consequence are themselves sort of hard to differentiate as well. Yeah, one consequence is your character takes damage, or maybe a valuable item takes damage, I would guess. Disappearance, maybe they just straight up disappear. Change, another one of that's sort of hard to differentiate change from transformation. Encounter, another thing that's kind of hard to differentiate from summoning. Disorder, and then phenomenon, which could be interesting, which is kind of fun, but also definitely very vague. So it's a pretty basic game. It's basically a premise and a set of lists of things that can happen that are very open-ended. The premise is fine. The list of things that can happen, I think, are kind of hard to apply to the premise for an entire party, especially with things like cost and consequence being so similar. But no, it's a 36-word game made for a jam, and for that, it's definitely interesting and something people could have some fun playing, which is really all it needs to be. I figured we'd look back for a minute on what I originally said about this game, because I thought it was a bit more in-depth, with a bit more attention than I was able to give it today. Yeah, the person who posted this game had previously posted a 24 or 36 word alt game, also table-based, called Spellify. I think that one was a little more polished, if you're interested in checking it out on the subreddit too. Yep. Something I missed going back over it was that you can, roll the d6 and then pick which table it applies to, or the language seems to imply that, which I think adds an element of fun and strategy there that the game is otherwise missing, so I think that's cool. Yeah, it does seem a bit more fun as with a group than a solo game. Yeah, I mentioned that cost and consequence are a little hard to distinguish. Yeah, and there's probably should be a bit more details about what one does with the artifact, or at least mention that that is a thing that happens in the story. Because there was just like a list for story of things that would happen. They appear in the forest, they venture into it, and then they escape. But there's no use artifact step, which I think it would benefit from. Yeah, and it would be nice to have some sort of idea for how long or how many rolls it takes to get to the artifact, though in a 36-word game, that could be difficult to implement. Yeah, and then just the usual informational bit. So yeah, not too different from what I said recently looking at it. It could probably be polished and refined a bit more to be even better, but for 36 words, there's only so much you can do. I think the artifact step would definitely be very helpful. Now we are taking a look at This Town Ain't Big Enough. The reason I didn't really post a video on this is because it's a game I made, and it was a little difficult for me to figure out how to do that in a way that wasn't just, I don't know, at all really, honestly. I just wasn't really sure how to make a just quick look video on it. But one of the main conceits is that there's a 24-word version of the game. I guess this isn't really a main conceit of the game, it's just an interesting feature I tried to implement. There's a 24-word version. There is a one-page version, and I'm saying version, but that's not really accurate. It's just you can use, different parts of the rulebook, and then you could also just take in the whole thing, and there's a lot of extra details in there. The basic premise is 2 players each take a die, roll it, starting before one line and then making sure it goes past another. And whoever die stops first shoots first. There's also a 3rd player, ideally acting as ref, and they start a countdown and the roll starts after that. So basically, you've got 3 players. They've each created their own gunslinger Western character briefly. The ref starts a countdown from 3, says roll, each player rolls, and whoever stops first wins. You're not supposed to roll before the countdown stops, and then if you mismanage the lines, if you start after the first line or stop before the second one, that counts as a miss. Basically, the idea is there's a bit of a skill and excitement element by trying to get as close to the end of the countdown as possible without rolling before it, and that also simulates an actual quick draw where each player is trying to wait for the signal and then draw as quickly as possible, and in this case roll as quickly as possible. But since it's the die stopping that triggers the shot, there's also a luck element and a waiting for the die to stop rolling element. So, there's luck, there's a bit of excitement and tension as you wait for things to stop. The lines are basically there to make it so someone can't just toss the die up in the air and have it land without rolling and shoot first that way. Just to make sure the die rolls a certain distance to make sure that tension element really comes into play. It might be a little bit overcomplicated, that rule system, but it does end up being fairly fun to play. There's also a bit of a character creation table to help players out. You pick one from here with a die or just randomly, and then you pick one from the second one if you don't want to just create your character. Each of these are sort of inspired by Western tropes, but they're set up in a way to make it so any character could potentially duel any other. That way, you can have 2 characters that you create a relationship with in the backstories, but they still end up fighting. There's a bit more in-depth information onto how the reasons work over here, but none of that's really necessary. I was able to play test this with a group of players that I normally play with, which I hadn't been able to do before for various reasons. And that did help me learn a lot of things. I think I've decided that when I modify this again, I'm going to focus more on the party game element. And I'm also going to focus on encouraging the role play in certain ways that I haven't really finalized yet. That wasn't a great overview, but like I said, I was having a lot of trouble figuring out how to even say this without writing out a script or anything, which isn't something I really like to do for these. So, that's just a brief explanation of what this game is. Something I did want to do, because it's just so similar, because we just last looked at a 36-word game, is looking at my version of a 24-word game and see if it really makes any sense. Because now that I've explained the game, this might make sense, but by itself, it's kind of debatable whether it does. Opposing gunslingers. That bit's supposed to tell you, that each player is a, gunslinger character. Countdown, roll. That part should be fairly obvious, There's a countdown and a roll. Of course, it doesn't really explain who does the countdown, but, oops. Dice land before a line, roll past another. a little more ambiguous here, but not necessarily hard to tell that, the intent is that the die is supposed to roll a basic distance with lines used to enforce it, basically. One stops, t'other's shot. Now this line, it kind of gets more confusing as you go on. This is confusing not only because I used t'others, which is, sort of a contraction of the other is, which is not, entirely unique to me, but I don't know how many people will be familiar with it. And since we go from the die stopping to the other player being shot, that's a little ambiguous too. I have thought before that maybe if this line was up here, was actually the second line, it would make a lot more sense, because then it's opposing gunslinger's countdown roll, one stops, the other shot, and that really directly explains what this is in reference to, but I don't necessarily think that's necessary. Anyway, on to the fourth line. Too soon, ref shoots. You know what? I confused my own explanation, actually. This does kind of make sense as the third line. I was thinking maybe this line should be back at the second, because then that's opposing gunslinger's countdown roll, too soon, ref shoots. And that really explains what too soon refers to. It's too soon on the countdown. With too soon all the way down here, that might create a little bit of confusion. And then this part, which is kind of confusing regardless, is ref shoots, but there was no ref established earlier on. And I think you can definitely guess that the ref is like a third player, or maybe just a character that exists to shoot players that roll too soon. But it's definitely hard to explain that in such a limited format. And then misline, target's fine. Right. So these, I definitely said that wrong. These were the two lines I thought maybe should be earlier. Like too soon being right after countdown and misline being right after line, so the consequences of failing are right after, the guidelines establishing what failure looks like, would probably make it more easy to understand, but it doesn't really read as nicely to me. Overall, I think as 24-word RPGs go, this isn't that confusing. Just because I've read a decent amount of them that you really have to, read a paragraph of text outside of the actual 24 words to understand what they're actually supposed to mean. In this one, I think you could maybe suss things out, but it's definitely far from the clearest I've ever seen. If this were an actual, pamphlet in and of itself with, visual aids to show what each step meant with pictures, I think it could definitely work as 24 words alone. As it stands, it probably wouldn't if you just read this, but I definitely appreciate hearing what other people think. Anyway, that's all I sort of want to talk about my game for this video. It's still a work in progress, but it's definitely playable. Personally, when I've played it, I've had a lot of fun, and so have the other people I've played it with, but I don't know if that exists just from people reading the pamphlet and then figuring out how to play it, or you need someone who actually knows what it's supposed to play like to be there to guide everything for it to work. I think this gets the rules down. I don't know if it really shows you what playing is like and is enough to understand, for someone to understand it just from reading it. And even if the game is fun, if you can't really get what it's supposed to be from the rulebook, or how it's supposed to be from the rulebook, that sort of doesn't matter. So, I'd definitely be interested to hear about other people playing it, but that goes for anyone with their projects, I'm sure. The next game we're looking at is Dieselpunk 1921. Now, this one is different from the other two, because the other two were pretty brief. Mine was potentially as long as, 8 or something pages, but if you were going by the quicker versions, which is what we were mainly looking at, it was not nearly as long as that. However, this one is, up to 136. So there's definitely enough, for me to have, in theory, created an in-depth video on it. Just going through the rules and trying to understand them and stuff like I normally do. The issue is, there is not a ton of this that is rules. It seems to be largely based off of, whatever the generic form of Call of Cthulhu is, whatever you call that. The Chaosium system. I don't know if they have multiple, honestly. But, the main one that people think of, I think. However, it's based off that, and it's not even as in-depth in rules as that. And the rules are not highly emphasized at all in the book. What is a lot of alternative history that, frankly, I just don't have the attention span or the grounding of knowledge to understand at all. The premise of the game is, I think it was World War I, not World War II. World War I goes differently. Germany wins. And along with that, or because of that, I think it's supposed to be because of that, but it's not really clear how Germany winning the war leads to this, or even why Germany won the war in this alternative history. There's different technology and stuff. The name is Dieselpunk, which sort of like steampunk, except everything being steam-powered, it's diesel and pollution and heavy industry and all of that. With also the punk element of resistance and stuff. So that's sort of like the basic premise, but beyond that, I couldn't really grasp all that much of it. Unfortunately, and something that is definitely odd to me, this game also does not go over any of the technology or really the appearance of the setting, at least in the bits I read, which was a decent amount, not like a ton, but a decent amount. Like, there's some bits on here, there are these cybernetic, I'll say, though cyber is probably the wrong word segment there, but these basically cyborg dogs that have mechanical parts that were originally created to, just help wounded war dogs, but were eventually used to just augment healthy dogs to be better for war, that sort of thing. And there are these walkers, which are these machines that run on two legs that are used in war and for transportation and stuff, and there's a whole page on prosthetics for people, or rather there's a whole page on the injuries people can get, and then you can get prosthetics for them, but I'm not sure the prosthetics themselves went into in depth. But other than like prosthetics and two-legged machines, which there isn't even that much on either of these things, the technology really isn't gone into at all. Yeah, here's some prosthetic stuffs. But there's not like a ton of info on any one of these. I was trying to look for the injury table because I do know that I enjoyed that. Yeah. Yeah, all of these have effects, and there are ways they heal over time, except some of them which require a prosthetic. I don't quite remember the details, but I remember this being interesting. And a lot of the system to me wasn't, because it's like all alternate history, and that's not really my area, especially when it's done kind of dryly like this. So I can't speak to too much of that, and that was the main focus of the system, it seems like. But I will say there was some sort of things in there that seemed like they were supposed to be, just expected, that I don't really know made sense. Like, there was stuff about how you know, the laborers were anti imperialistic, even though you'd think the people working in the factories, which is largely what I think it was referred to, would be in favor of the, war that was giving them jobs. There was also soldiers that were defecting from the army and then siding with the government they defected with. It was just a lot of. It kind of seems like the system is not billing itself as supposed to be a clear depiction of good things and bad things, but it actually kind of is doing that. Like, industrialism bad, but workers good, imperialism bad, which, I'm not necessarily disagreeing with, but. Trying to remember what my point was. Imperialism, it's just like, it's trying to really force itself into being a story about two different sides, when for this kind of thing you'd really expect like a lot of different competing factions within each country and interests. And I just didn't really get what they were going for thematically. It's not something that's easy to explain. I'm trying to find the section it seemed to come up the most, if I remember right. It was like British Civil War stuff. And even looking back, I can't even find specific things I remembered because it's not labeled in a way that is really conducive to going back. Okay, yeah, so this is sort of what I'm talking about. There's a British Civil War, and deserting soldiers and nationalist street fighters repress labor organizers, but also being repressed to the anti war protesters, which you'd think the deserters would be somewhat sympathetic to. And then you've got the anti imperialist Republicans, communists, anarchists, all apparently easily getting along, which, maybe wouldn't be what would happen. Yeah, but there are soldiers that are siding with the United Front, just not the ones that deserted. And the idea that, like, there's a monarchist league, but it's really not clear where the government even comes into any of this. And it's stated as a civil war, but it kind of seems like more like a revolution because you don't really have opposing governments. So, like, this whole section, I don't think I'm explaining well, but I didn't really get it. I didn't get a lot of the alternate history stuff. And, like, a lot of it seems like, socialist based ideology about labor and stuff like that, but it's not explicitly stated to be that, which makes it kind of hard to place. Anyway, basically, I couldn't really grasp this one because it was all alternate history, and I also feel like it does do somewhat of a poor job making that alternate history entertaining or make sense at a basic level. And I'm not saying as in even the basics of it didn't make sense. I'm saying that if you look at it from a basic level, I don't think it makes sense. Like, maybe it all makes sense to someone who is more well-versed in history, but to me it's just kind of confusing and frequently counterintuitive. So, I had trouble really reviewing this system, which is why I didn't make a video on it, but I've gone over sort of 3 games that we featured recently, said what I could about them. Not really much else to say. The subreddit is doing kind of I think it coincides with some weird changes Reddit did where you can't see how many members a sub has. You can just see how many new people visited in a week. And now the engagement seems like a ton lower than it used to be. Not that it was that big to begin with, but, we'll see what happens. If you have any suggestions on things to do for the sub or for these videos, definitely feel free to mention them in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm probably not putting the names of the game in the title, because, on the rare occasions that I get, really only one occasion that I've gotten criticism for one of these videos, I think it was just that, it existing in a way that could lead back to the game and being largely, well, not even largely critical, but being somewhat critical was something that bothered the creator, so I won't bother, since this video can't really be that positive, I won't bother putting the titles in the video just in case. If it was something that only existed on Reddit, sure, but, I have to post these all on videos on YouTube first, and I'm sure some people are worried about people searching up the name of their game and just getting me being confused about them in it, which is, not a great advertisement. Anyway, if you have any suggestions, feel free to mention them. Bye.